New Year's Day, right? You think of new beginnings, fresh starts. But in New Orleans this year, it was anything but.
Yeah, that attack on Bourbon Street, just horrific. The kind of event that really makes you question things.
And it's exactly the kind of event we need to dissect, not to minimize the human cost, but to really understand how something like this, seemingly isolated, can send shockwaves through, well, everything. Yeah. Business, finance, even politics.
Because it's all connected, right? When something like this happens, it's not just the immediate tragedy. The ripple effects just keep spreading.
Exactly. So for our listeners, let's set the scene. We're talking about Bourbon Street, the heart of New Orleans, New Year's Eve. The place is packed.
And then completely out of nowhere, this rented Ford F-150 truck just plows right into the crowd.
That's a horrifying image. The driver, we later find out, is a 42-year-old man named Shamsuddin Bahar Jabbar, U.S. Army vet, originally from Texas.
Deliberately targeting people, just out celebrating.
15 people died that night, over 30 injured. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Months before the attack, Jabbar had actually pledged allegiance to ISIS.
Publicly, too. Posting videos online outlining his extremist views, even talking about his plans for an attack.
So, not just a random act of violence, then?
Definitely not. This was calculated, potentially inspired by a global network of extremists carried out right here on U.S. soil.
And initially, the FBI thought there might be more to the story. Surveillance footage showed other people near the scene planting what looked like explosives. Naturally, with all the chaos, investigators were worried about accomplices.
I can even imagine the pressure in those first few hours. A major terrorist attack, the city in lockdown, trying to figure out who's involved, what the motive is, all while knowing there could be more to come.
Talk about a high-stakes investigation. But then, as things progressed, the picture started to change. The FBI analyzed the explosives, the truck, and something stood out. Jabbar's fingerprints were everywhere.
And no trace of anyone else.
Which completely shifted the focus. Instead of a network, now you're dealing with a lone wolf.
Which, in a way, raises even more questions.
Right. How do you even prevent something like this when it's just one person acting on their own? What does this say about domestic terrorism? About homegrown extremism?
These are questions that keep intelligence agencies up at night. How do you identify these individuals? How do you predict when someone's going to go from extremist views to actual violence?
It's a whole different ballgame, isn't it?
Absolutely. A constantly evolving challenge. And the impact goes way beyond that night on Bourbon Street. Think about the Sugar Bowl.
Huge game.
Yeah. Scheduled that weekend, and because of the attack, heightened security, it had to be postponed.
Not just symbolic either.
Not at all. Think about the economic hit New Orleans took. Hotels, restaurants, tourism, all those businesses taking a loss. And what message does that send to investors? Even in a city known for bouncing back, there's this underlying vulnerability.
It makes you wonder, what kind of security measures did New Orleans have in place? Could anything have been done to prevent this?
Well, here's the thing. They were actually in the process of upgrading, replacing those old bollards, the short posts that stop cars from getting into pedestrian areas, getting newer, stronger barriers.
Sounds like a good idea, bad timing.
Exactly. It happened during this transition period, so some areas were more vulnerable. They had temporary barriers up, but
a heavy-duty truck, a determined attacker.
It wasn't enough.
And of course, anytime something like this happens, the political machine kicks into gear. President Biden, as you'd expect, condemned the attack, called it despicable, odious, pledged full federal support.
And then you have the incoming president-elect Donald Trump. He, of course, labeled it pure evil and initially even suggested the suspect might be an illegal immigrant.
Which turned out to be completely false.
Exactly. But he used the opportunity to criticize border policies, even announced a rally focused on national security.
So even in a national tragedy, you have politics and opportunism at play. But let's shift gears for a second. What was the overall sentiment, in New Orleans, across the country?
It was a mix. Grief, outrage, fear, of course. But also this incredible resilience. You saw hashtags like hashtag Noel Strong and hashtag West Stand Together trending everywhere.
A community coming together.
Exactly. But the attack also sparked a lot of debate. People questioning national security policies, wondering if more could have been done to prevent Jabbar's radicalization. Others focused on the need for better veteran mental health programs, thinking about early intervention. And of course, plenty of criticism directed at authorities for not seeing this coming.
Which is a fair point. But it's a complex issue, right? This attack exposed vulnerabilities, not just in physical security, but in how we identify and address extremism itself. And as we move forward, I think one of the biggest questions is, how do we balance the need for security with protecting individual liberties?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll keep unpacking in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll look closer at the investigation, at the FBI's role, and what, if anything, could have been done to prevent this.
Welcome back. Picking up where we left off, it's hard to overstate how devastating the New Orleans attack was. But we're going beyond just the headlines, looking at the wider impact and how events like this really touch everything, from tourism to the whole national conversation about security.
Right, and as we dig deeper into the investigation itself, it really highlights how complex these situations are. Last time we were talking about the FBI, and they were pretty quick to call this domestic terrorism, weren't they?
Absolutely. And that was crucial, that classification. It basically opened the floodgates, allowing them to bring the full force of federal resources to bear. Specialized agents, forensic teams, intelligence analysts, everything. It also sent a clear message to the public and the world that the U.S. government was taking this threat very, very seriously. But there were some people who criticized the FBI, right? Say maybe they missed something, that if they'd been paying closer attention, this whole thing could have been prevented. Was there any merit to that?
It's a valid question, for sure, the kind that always comes up after a tragedy like this. Because remember, Jabbar had been posting extremist stuff online for months, pledged allegiance to ISIS even. So it's natural to ask, did the FBI miss any red flags? Could they have stepped in sooner?
It's always easier to look back, you know?
Yeah.
With hindsight, it all seems so obvious. But the reality is, identifying and actually stopping these lone wolf attackers, it's incredibly difficult.
Like trying to find a needle in a haystack. A haystack that's constantly shifting and growing. Think about it. You have intelligence agencies monitoring tons of data, trying to filter out the noise and find the real threats. And when you're dealing with someone like Jabbar, acting alone, no criminal record, no direct ties to any known terrorist group, it's exponentially harder.
So how do you even begin to tackle a problem like that?
It's the question everyone's asking, and there's no simple answer. Some experts say the FBI needs to be even more proactive, maybe working more closely with tech companies to flag extremist content, identify people who might be vulnerable to radicalization.
What, then you run into issues of privacy, free speech?
Exactly. It's that constant balancing act between security and freedom, a conversation we need to keep having, especially with how technology is changing, how the threat of online radicalization keeps evolving.
Let's talk about that initial confusion, though, about whether Jabbar had accomplices. You mentioned the surveillance footage showing other people near the scene. What was it that finally convinced the FBI he acted alone?
It was a few things, actually. First, the forensics. Jabbar's fingerprints were all over that truck. The explosives, no one else's. Second, they went deep into his digital footprint, phone records, internet history, social media, everything. And the picture that emerged was of a guy who had meticulously planned and carried out this attack all by himself.
But what about the footage? It seemed pretty damning at first.
It did, and understandably so. But the FBI, after painstakingly analyzing hours of footage from different angles, they were able to piece together a timeline that showed without a doubt that it was actually Jabbar himself planting those devices. It ended up being a case of mistaken identity, grainy footage, tensions running high.
Chilling to think how easily they could have gone down the wrong path. Can't imagine the pressure those investigators were under.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show how complex these investigations are. One wrong assumption, one piece of evidence misinterpreted, and the whole thing could unravel. And the stakes, as we've seen, are incredibly high.
Speaking of high stakes, let's get back to the political reactions to the attack. We touched on this before, but it's worth digging a little deeper. Biden condemned it. Trump did what Trump does. But beyond the typical partisan responses, what were some of the bigger political implications?
Well, it immediately reignited the debate about border security. Even though, Jabbar was a U.S. citizen, Trump and his supporters used this to push their hardline immigration agenda, arguing that this proved we need stronger borders, the wall, tougher vetting of immigrants.
Even though, as we said, the facts didn't back that up.
Exactly. Which highlights how these kinds of tragedies can be used, exploited even, for political gain. Even if it means twisting the truth or fueling fear and division.
Was there anyone who pushed back against that narrative?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Mostly Democrats and some more moderate Republicans. They pointed out that fixating on the border was a distraction, ignoring the very real threat of homegrown extremism, the complexity of how people become radicalized. They were calling for a more nuanced approach, one that tackled the root causes of terrorism, social and economic inequality, mental health issues, the spread of extremist content online, things like that.
Which brings us back to Jabbar's military background. Did that play into the political conversation at all? Was there any talk about PTSD or the struggles veterans face when they come home from combat?
For sure, Jabbar, being a veteran, brought those issues PTSD, the challenges of reintegration, right to the forefront. Some politicians, especially on the left, use this as a chance to advocate for more funding for veteran mental health services, arguing that if we can intervene early, offer support, we can help prevent veterans from falling through the cracks and potentially reduce the risk of tragedies like this happening again.
It's a reminder that there's always a human story behind the headlines, right?
Yeah.
This complex mix of factors that lead someone down the path toward radicalization.
Exactly. And if we really want to tackle extremism, we have to be willing to look beyond the surface, to understand those root causes and come up with strategies that address them head on.
Okay, so we've talked about the investigation, the political fallout, but what about the public? How did people react as more details came out about the attack, about the perpetrator?
Well, public opinion, just like the political landscape, became even more polarized. I mean, everyone condemned the attack itself, of course. But when it came to the causes, the right responses, that's where things diverged, reflecting, the deep divisions we have in our society.
So it just became another battleground in the culture wars.
Sadly, yeah. Some people, echoing Trump's rhetoric, doubled down on stricter border control, a tougher approach to terrorism. Others focused on things like gun control, mental health, arguing those were the real issues we needed to tackle.
It's like we're stuck in this cycle, just reacting to these events without actually addressing the underlying problems. Were there any positive outcomes, though? Any glimmers of hope in all of this?
Absolutely, and this is what I find so fascinating about people. Even in the face of horrific violence, even with all the division, there are always these moments of incredible compassion, of unity. We saw it here in the outpouring of support for the victims, for their families, people from all walks of life coming together, offering condolences, donating money, volunteering their time. There were interfaith vigils, community gatherings, just countless acts of kindness and generosity.
That's New Orleans for you. Resilient, compassionate, always ready to help each other out.
Exactly. And beyond the immediate support, you saw a renewed focus on building community, on dialogue, people recognizing that we need to bridge those divides, to fight hate with understanding, with empathy.
But that brings up another challenge. How do you actually combat hate and extremism in the digital age, where these ideologies can spread so quickly online? Jabbar was radicalized online. How did this attack change the conversation about online extremism and the role these social media companies play?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's something we'll explore in detail in part 3. We'll get into the dark side of the internet, how these algorithms can create echo chambers that just reinforce extremist views. And we'll look at what, if anything, can be done to actually stop the spread of hate and violence online.
We've covered a lot of ground so far. The attack itself, the investigation, the political fallout. But now we got to talk about this whole other dimension, this online world.
Yeah.
Because Jabbar didn't just become radicalized overnight, did he?
No, not at all. It's like a slow burn, right? He's drawn in, little by little, by this whole web of extremist ideology, and it's all amplified by these algorithms that are designed to keep you clicking, keep you engaged.
It's almost insidious how it works.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine someone like Jabbar struggling to adjust back to civilian life, maybe feeling isolated, disillusioned. He stumbles across some extremist content online, maybe just by chance at first.
And that's when those algorithms kick in. They see what he's looking at, what he's responding to, and they start feeding him more and more of the same. It's like they're actively pushing him deeper into this world of hate and violence.
It's a rabbit hole, and there's no easy way out once you're in it. You start out maybe just curious, maybe even skeptical, but then you're bombarded with all these carefully crafted messages designed to exploit your fears, your prejudices, and before you know it, you're trapped in this echo chamber, surrounded by people who are just reinforcing your worst impulses.
And the really scary part is a lot of times people don't even realize what's happening. These algorithms are working in the background, manipulating what you see, what you think. People think they're choosing what they want to see, but in reality, those choices are being made for them.
So what can we do about it? I mean, is this something we could even legislate? Do we need to start regulating these algorithms, holding these tech companies accountable for what's being shared on their platforms?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? And it's a debate that's raging right now because it's a complicated issue with no easy answers. On the one hand, you have the principle of free speech. It's a fundamental right, a cornerstone of our democracy. We can't just start censoring everything that someone finds offensive or controversial. But on the other hand, we also have a responsibility to protect people from harm. And that includes protecting them from the very real dangers of online radicalization.
There it is again. That constant tension between security and freedom. It seems like in the digital age, that balancing act has become even more difficult.
Absolutely. And the stakes are higher than ever because now we're not just talking about words on a page. We're talking about words that have the power to incite violence, to lead to real-world harm.
So how do we find that balance? What's the solution?
Honestly, I don't think there's a single solution. It's going to take a multifaceted approach, but I think the first step is just acknowledging the problem. We have to recognize that online radicalization is a real threat, and it's something that can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime.
It's not just some abstract concept, some far-off threat, right? It's happening right here, right now, in our own communities.
Exactly. And I think we also have to start having some tough conversations about the role of these tech companies. They can't just keep hiding behind this idea that they're neutral platforms. They have a responsibility to design their algorithms in a way that doesn't amplify hate speech and division. They need to invest in better content moderation, be more transparent about how their platforms are being used to spread these harmful ideologies.
It's like we've given them this incredible power, right?
Yeah.
The ability to shape what we see, what we think, how we understand the world. And as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. But are these tech giants really living up to that responsibility?
That's a question we all need to be asking, and the consequences of their inaction are becoming clearer by the day. The New Orleans attack is a tragic example of how the online world can have very real, very devastating, real-world consequences. What starts as an echo chamber online can spill over into violence and terror, destroying lives and shaking the foundations of our society.
So what can we do as individuals? We can't just sit back and wait for the government or the tech companies to solve this for us.
You're absolutely right. We all have a responsibility to create a healthier online environment. It starts with being more critical consumers of information, being more aware of our own biases and how those biases can be exploited by algorithms. And it means being willing to challenge hate and extremism whenever we see it, even if it means having uncomfortable conversations.
So be vigilant, be informed, be engaged. Don't just take everything you see online at face value. Dig a little deeper. Ask questions. Think critically about the information you're consuming.
And if you see something that's hateful, that's promoting violence or extremism, don't just scroll past it. Report it. Challenge the person who posted it. Engage in constructive dialogue.
Because silence in the face of hate can be just as dangerous as the hate itself. We all have a responsibility to speak up, to stand up for what's right, and to create a world where this kind of extremism, this kind of violence, has no place, online or offline.
The New Orleans attack was a horrific tragedy, but it can also be a wake-up call. If we can learn from this, if we take action to address these underlying issues, then maybe, just maybe, something good can come out of this senseless loss of life.
We've covered some heavy stuff today, but it's a conversation that needs to happen. And it's something we're going to keep exploring, keep digging into, because we need to understand how events like this, they impact everything. Our businesses, our finances, our politics, our culture. We have to be aware of the challenges, and we have to work together to find solutions.
Because the future really does depend on it.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. Keep asking questions. Keep the conversation going. The more we understand, the better equipped we'll be to build a safer, more just, and more resilient world.